I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening to the Breakpoint Podcast. Is Christianity anti-woman? That's the question tackled by Dr. Joe Vitale at the 2019 Wilberforce Weekend. Dr. Vitale discusses Jesus' utterly revolutionary and countercultural attitude toward women, and how the Judeo-Christian concept of human beings, male and female, as being made in the image of God, provides the only basis for treating women with dignity and as equals to men. Here's Dr. Joe Vitale.
Our next speaker, Joe Vitale, was a speaker at the Wilberforce Weekend pre-conference 2 years ago, the first year that we did such a pre-conference, and she did such a great job that we wanted to bring her back to address the entire group. Joe Vitale is an apologist, a speaker, a writer with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, and she'll address our theme, Is Christianity Good for the World?, by addressing a common argument made against Christianity, which is that it is anti-woman. So, to ask and answer the question, is Christianity anti-woman? Please welcome Joe Vitale.
Thanks so much, Warren. I'm not sure quite what it means that all the millennials are after lunch, but it is so good to be here with you today. Sorry, let me just get this going. There we go. As you can tell from the accent, I'm not from around here. I've been living in Atlanta for the last 2 years, but I'm actually from over the pond. Though these days my primary responsibility whenever I go back home is really to be the Christmas card mule for John Lennox. He claims that Christmas cards are much cheaper over here, so he buys them in bulk, and then I have to smuggle them over the border. He's obviously a really popular guy because it's a lot of Christmas cards. But as someone who grew up in the church in England, I can still remember as a teenager the first time that I read the novel The Great Gatsby. And these words that Daisy Buchanan spoke, they just lodged in my mind when she has this to say about her daughter. I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. And as I read those words, I remember questioning whether that was all Christianity expected of me too, whether my purpose was just to be ornamental or decorative, to be seen but not heard. And I think right this moment, we are living in a culture that is in uproar over this very sentiment, with many women today feeling not just unheard, but unseen. And this concern has never felt more pressing to me than it did when I was giving a talk on UC Berkeley's campus that just happened to coincide with International Women's Day. Now, as you can imagine, in the birthplace of the free speech movement, International Women's Day is a big deal at Berkeley. There were lots of marches and protests and yelling and signs. And right in the middle of this kind of crazy, angry scene, there stood a girl in the main thoroughfare of campus, and she was wearing fishnet tights and a short denim skirt, and she was topless with just a paper bag over her head with the eyes cut out. And you could tell that people didn't really know what to make of this public spectacle. Some people laughed at her out of shock. Other people immediately turned their eyes away and hurried on by. But then if you got close enough to her, if you approached her, then you could see written across the top of the paper bag were these words: "All 5 of my rapists are getting away with it." And then you looked into her eyes, and they were just completely haunted. And for confidentiality's sake, I'm going to call her Rachel. You know, as I stood there looking at Rachel, I found myself wondering, what would Jesus Christ have to say to her? What would Jesus have to say to Rachel? You know, in that moment, as overwhelming as it was, I actually found myself feeling so thankful to know that the Christian God is real. And I felt that way for 3 reasons that I'm going to share with you this afternoon. The first is this, that only God gives intrinsic worth. You know, that story that I shared with Rachel, it's rightly disturbing to us. But you know, actually from a purely naturalistic perspective, it's hard to justify why what happened to her specifically, someone that you don't even know, is such a big deal. After all, if our lives are just cosmic evolutionary accidents, on what basis are we going to assign value or significance to another person, let alone equal value? We talk about women's rights, But what are we grounding them on? And if we're just dancing to our DNA and the name of the game is survival, then why shouldn't we say that one life is of greater worth than the other, or that might makes right, or that it's every man for himself? In the fairly harrowing words of the poet Steve Turner, it leads us to this conclusion. My love, she said when all's considered we're only machines. I chained her to my bedroom wall for future use, and she cried. You know, the Bible, it tells us a radically different story, and it does so right from the very first page. God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them male and female. He created them. According to Christianity, you're not random. You are intended, and you're no accident. You are made, male and female alike, as image bearers. Now, from our 21st century perspective, perhaps that doesn't strike you as all that remarkable, but compare this to other ancient beliefs, such as these words from the 5th century Greek philosopher Plato, who has this to say: it's only males who are created directly by the gods and are given souls. Those who live rightly return to the stars. But those who are cowards may with reason be supposed to have changed into the nature of women in the second generation. So according to Plato, men alone are created directly by the gods, and the punishment for cowardly men is that your soul will be reborn as a woman. Gentlemen in the room, you have been warned. You know, how different from Christianity, where not only are women like men considered fully human, but they too are made in the very likeness of God. And how sad that those who claim to be too feminist for Christianity rarely see that the very equality that they long for is ultimately grounded in the very same God that they are rejecting. There's simply no other statement of gender equality like this in the ancient world. And what a difference understanding human life as sacred and equal actually made to the early church, who helped end the Roman practice of exposure, the killing of newborn infants, which not only devalued human life, but disproportionately affected female children. And what good might this do for the world today if we too understood this, particularly in light of the ongoing global crisis of gendercide, which accounts for 200 million unborn girls that the UN have estimated are missing today in our world. Understanding this also makes sense of why we so instinctively grieve what happened to Rachel. Because what took place was a violation of the most sacred thing in the world, a human person. And yet at the same time, if Christianity's teaching about worth is true, then it also means that no matter what happens, no matter what she does or what has been done to her, nothing can strip her of her dignity or make her less than, because her worth is defined by the God who made her in his image and who fiercely loves her. It's God alone who gives worth. And secondly, it is God alone who guarantees justice. You know, what I found fascinating about those Berkeley students was that although identifying as moral relativists, they were totally committed to their fight for social justice. And the question is, how do you reconcile those two things? You know, if there's no such thing as right and wrong, why do we care so much about righting the world's wrongs? You know, we live in a culture, it increasingly denounces the moral absolutes that undergird justice, and yet at the very same time, these days, people are quicker than ever before to point out that the God of the Bible is not only immoral, but unjust, and not least in his treatment of women. And if we're honest with ourselves, it's probably not hard to see why. Even as Christians, we come across stories in the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, that are genuinely shocking and will strike us as sexist from a modern perspective. As a teenager, I can remember watching a PG-13 movie with my sister when, to my absolute mortification, my grandfather walked into the room in the one scene that you never want your grandfather to walk into the room while you're watching. And immediately jumping to all kinds of conclusions, he looked from the screen to us, and then he just shook his head and said, "Don't you girls have anything better to watch?" And then he walked out the room. And isn't it amazing how much my grandfather sounds like Os Guinness? But you know, so often we treat the Bible exactly the same way. When we step into the Old Testament, we are stepping into a wildly different world and a wildly different culture. And yet, how often do we walk into a scene, immediately assume the absolute worst because it makes us uncomfortable, and then we walk out again without ever taking the time to consider what might be going on, or even trying to give it the benefit of the doubt and understand the context? The truth of the matter is, as an ancient historical record that intentionally describes both the highs and the extreme lows of human behavior, the Bible doesn't shy away from retelling stories that are genuinely distressing, stories that include rape, polygamy, incest, and violence against women. But rather than being surprised by this, therefore, the question we need to ask is why? Why is this passage included in the first place? As one example, just consider with me Judges, chapters 19 to 20, which feminist biblical commentators have labeled a text of terror. Now, this is the appalling tale of a Levite man who, in an attempt to save his own skin from a violent mob who've surrounded the house that he's staying in, he throws his concubine out the door. And the fact there's a concubine in the first place is a whole other problem. But there she is gang raped all through the night and then left for dead. At which point the Levite steps out the door in the morning, finds her dead at the door, and in a horrifying act of desecration, he dismembers her body and sends the pieces out to the other tribes of Israel, calling upon them for vengeance. And it leads to this bloody war. You know, there are so many problems with what happens in this story, not just the crime itself, but also in the misplaced reaction of God's people, whose trigger-happy response falls so far short of enacting true justice for the wronged women that they don't even call the Levite to account for his callous disposal of her. Feminist commentators are right. This truly is a text of terror. But what they typically overlook, however, is that it's intended to be. You know, this story is written as a fierce indictment against a society that has turned against God and begun to do only what was right in their own eyes. What a striking phrase that is. People doing what is right in their own eyes. Sounds a lot like moral relativism to me. Which is why when people say to me, Joe, how could this story be in the Bible? I respond, how could it not be? Particularly in light of the Me Too movement, I can't think of a more important Old Testament text for women today than this story. Because at a time when victims of domestic or sexual abuse not only feel unheard but unseen, the public record of this account in Scripture stands as an undeniable statement that even though her rapists don't see her, even though the Levite doesn't see her, even though God's own people fail to properly see her, God will not allow this woman to go unseen. Instead, he puts her story front and center. He immortalizes what happens in Scripture, and therefore he ensures that it will be witnessed down the centuries until even thousands of years later, we are still talking about it this afternoon. And in doing so, God not only confronts us with the horrendous reality of what happens when a culture simply does what's right in their own eyes, but he demands that in our remembering, we don't go and do likewise, that we respond differently. Contrary to the accusation of the Me Too movement, there is no cover-up here. This text instead serves as further evidence why, far from being left to our own devices, we need an all-seeing God who enacts justice. It's also notable that the means by which God enacts justice is not at the expense of women, but oftentimes by empowering them to be the bringers of justice. Take the prophet Deborah, for example, in that very same book of Judges. And how remarkable that over 3,000 years before the first female justice, Sandra Day O'Connor, was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1981, Deborah was appointed as judge of all Israel. And Scripture records her as one of the few who successfully led the nation of Israel, not only through military victory, but through 40 years of peace. In a world that all too often abuses, oppresses, or overlooks women, the God of the Old Testament does things differently. In the words of Hagar, another despised concubine who on the worst day of her life encounters God in a dramatic and deeply personal way, Hagar gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, "You are the God who sees me." And she said, "I've now seen the one who sees me." And this same divine concern carries over from the Old to the New Testament, even into a time in history where cultural perceptions of women have become so negative that by the first century, one Jewish historian noted that the woman, says the law, is in all things inferior to the man. This is the world Jesus grew up in. And yet this comparison only makes his own attitude towards women all the more striking. For example, in Jesus' day, the influence of Greek culture upon Jewish thought had led to the widespread belief that women succumb to sexual temptation far more easily than men. And therefore, to catch sight of a beautiful woman was to find yourself in grave danger. As one Jewish law code even stated, it's more dangerous to walk behind a woman than it is to walk behind a lion. And in that culture, it was not only the men who were blamed for sexual immorality, but it was always the women whose powers of seduction had led him astray. And how tragic that 2,000 years have passed and we're still tangled up in those same arguments. And yet into this context, Jesus preaches the Sermon on the Mount, in which he turns these cultural assumptions totally on their head by saying, I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. You know, any man who heard Jesus say that would have immediately fallen off his seat, because Jesus is teaching the exact opposite of what his culture taught. He challenges his hearers to recognize that lust begins in our own hearts and we need to take responsibility for it. And therefore he calls them to a higher standard of seeing women not as sexual objects, but as human beings equally made in the image of God. And given today's public discourse surrounding female opportunity, Jesus' attitude towards female education was also striking, particularly living at a time when the education of women was so strongly discouraged that Jewish legislation stated if any man gives his daughter a knowledge of the law, it's as though he taught her lechery. And yet when Martha summons her sister Mary away from where Jesus is teaching and back into the kitchen, Jesus actually stops her from leaving. And he says that Mary has chosen what is better, and it won't be taken away from her. Far from stifling women, through the Gospels, we see Jesus Christ going up against culturally oppressive attitudes towards women and radically overturning them. So much so that even 2,000 years later, the question that Jesus asks in Luke chapter 7, while a woman kneels weeping at his feet, still reverberates as just as strong of a challenge for us today. Do you see this woman? Do you see this woman? How deeply that mirrors the cries of our own culture today. And yet, while I deeply respected those protesters, I couldn't help but feel a kind of sadness. Because at the end of the day, as Star has already spoken to, all it took was one look at Rachel to see that beneath the paper bag, whatever progress we might make as human beings, it was never going to be enough. Never enough, because our issues go so much deeper than any social or political or legal remedy can fix, running all the way down to the problem that Jesus himself identified, the problem with the human heart. In the words of the Russian author Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who spent 8 years in a Soviet labor camp in the 1940s, if only it were all so simple, if only there were evil people somewhere committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil runs through the heart of every human being. And who's willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? And while the commitment to social justice, in many ways can be seen as an important task, ultimately we cannot expect external solutions to fix internal problems. The hard reality is that human justice will always fall short. And how good is it then that Jesus Christ was unwavering in his commitment to the cause of divine justice? And isn't that exactly what his death on the cross symbolizes to us? The cross being the strongest and most overt statement God could have made that we are not okay. That our lives have so badly disagreed with the way that God intended for us to live them, that the only fitting judgment for the ways that we debase and dehumanize and abuse and violate and destroy one another is death. A judgment so serious it cost the Son of God his life. To those of us who've never been the victims of gross injustice, that judgment may seem too severe. But to the woman standing with a paper bag over her head, proclaiming all 5 of my rapists are getting away with it, God's commitment to justice, a commitment that runs all the way from the Old to the New Testament and culminating at the cross, is a hope for her to hold on to. A hope that no matter how badly wrong she has been, and no matter how badly human justice will fail her, there is a God who will ensure that justice is served and that the judge of all the earth will do what is right. And likewise, there will be some of you here, even today, who have been treated very badly. And that matters to God. That truly, deeply matters to him. It matters so much that God not only displays his judgment on the cross, but moving to our final reason why Christianity is such good news for women today. No matter how defaced or dehumanized you have been made to feel or made others feel, no matter what kind of bag or mask you might wear over your face, there is a God who sees right to the heart of you. A God who looked on Rachel at Berkeley with such compassion in her harassed and helpless state that in the person of Jesus, he willingly chose to come and live a human life, to step down and look out from the inside of the paper bag, as it were. To become one from whom men hide their faces, to be publicly ridiculed, to know what it's like to wear nothing but shame, to undergo unbelievable isolation and violation and suffering. Also that Rachel wouldn't be on her own in it. She wouldn't be alone in her suffering because Jesus has stepped down into it out of love and come and stood alongside of her. You know, that day at Berkeley, as soon as she laid eyes on her, one of my teammates, Madeline Jackson, she just had the overwhelming impression that the Holy Spirit was saying to her, out of everybody here on this campus today, I identify with her. I'm here for her. And so Madeline approached Rachel and she began to share just a couple of the things that I've shared with you today. And as she did, Rachel began to weep. And then she threw her arms around Madeline and she hung onto her so tightly. And they just stood there crying together in the middle of that square. And then Madeline asked if she could pray for her, and Rachel said yes. And so they stood there holding hands and praying, with everybody else walking on by thinking, what on earth is going on here? You know, that was the day that Rachel was introduced to the living God of the Bible for the very first time. A God who sees women as valuable. A God who's committed to justice. And a God who loves every one of us so much that he's willing to lay down his life for us. You could not be more pro-women than that. And gives us a new life, a life lived with dignity and strength and purpose, the purpose that he made every one of us for. You know, when I look at Jesus Christ, I see exactly the kind of man that I want to spend time with, and exactly the kind of God that it is a privilege to worship. And I think that is very good news for the world. Thank you.
Shane Morris here again. I hope you enjoyed Dr. Joe Vitale's presentation at the 2019 Wilberforce Weekend. Before I leave you today, I wanted to alert you that we have now scheduled the next in our series of extremely popular online short courses. The topic of this one is homosexuality, climate change, abortion, and transgenderism. What would you say? Beginning August 6th, join with Andrew Walker, Jay Richards, Ryan Bloomberger, and Sandra Glahn as we explore a thoroughly Christian response to these tough issues. Come to breakpoint.org, click on this podcast, and we'll tell you how you can register. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening.